6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening, it's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. The strongest proponents of the Green movement delight in bad news and cannot see a pudding without over-egging it. They like to view worst-case scenarios as fact and seize on any news story, such as wildfires in the Mediterranean, as proof of their cause, even though these are annual occurrences. But what will lead to civilizational collapse is the fearmongering itself, as more and more young people have cited global warming as the reason they won't be having children. If you think climate change is a threat to mankind, you can be even more sure that not having children will end humanity altogether. I'll be explaining why we should be encouraged to have more children. Nigel Farage claims his second scalp as Coutts' chief executive, Peter Flavel, steps down over what he has called the bank's fallen standards of personal service. But he still hasn't replied to Mr. Farage's personal messages. Surely, if the bank wants to make amends, it should overturn its improper decision and give Nigel back his bank account. Another cost of lockdown, specifically on our children. As we have failed to get children back into the classroom to pre-pandemic levels, new research suggests these ghost children are 3 times more likely to turn to violent crime. Plus, as it's emerged, the leader of His Majesty's opposition deprived his children of meat for the first 10 years of their lives. State of the Nation has conducted an exclusive focus group amongst 6 well-informed Somerset children for their views on this controversial practice. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by a Moggalicious panel this evening, co-founder of Momentum, James Schneider, and the former Brexit Party MEP, Annunziata Rees-Mogg. As ever, I want to hear from you. As you know, it's the most important part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's time for the news of the day with Tatiana Sanchez.
Jacob, thank you very much. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. The CEO of Coutts Bank, Peter Flavel, has stepped down with immediate effect. Its interim boss said the resignation was agreed by mutual consent and is the right decision for Coutts and the wider group. Mr Flavel says that in the handling of Mr Farage's case, the bank had fallen below the high standards of personal service. He's also said he bears full responsibility for poor handling of Nigel Farage's case. In response to his resignation, Farage says it was only a matter of time. It follows the resignation of the former CEO of NatWest Group, Dame Alison Rose, who could be in line for a £5 million payoff. British gas owner Centrica has revealed that earnings at its gas and electricity supply arm have soared by 889% to £969 million in the 6 months to June. Shadow Climate Secretary Ed Miliband says the scale of the profits show that the money isn't being reinvested into energy production and is instead being funneled back to shareholders. But the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak insists that energy companies' windfall profits are being taxed to support consumers, helping to pay around half of a typical family's energy bill. Tram operators have been fined a total of £14 million over the Croydon derailment, which killed 7 people. Many more were injured when a tram carrying 69 people derailed near the Sandyland stop in November 2016. Transport for London and Tram Operations Limited have accepted failing in their health and safety duties. Mr Justice Fraser told the court this was undoubtedly an accident waiting to happen. Wildfires in Greece continue despite a drop in temperatures. Blazes have spread across the country for more than a week, killing 3 people and causing over 20,000 tourists to evacuate roads. 61 more fires have erupted in Greece in the last 24 hours, with footage showing cliffs and trees scorched by the blazes. In Albania, crews continue to battle the flames across the country's southern region, with emergency helicopters dropping water on the affected areas. In Italy, the extent of the devastation can be seen after a wildfire turned the hills surrounding a 5th-century temple into ash. And finally, no medical cause has been given for the death of Irish singer Sinead O'Connor, who was found unresponsive at her home in London yesterday. An autopsy will be conducted, with the results expected to take several weeks. The 56-year-old's death is not being treated as suspicious. TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. You're with GB News. Now it's back to Jacob.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this continues to be State of the Nation. Now, the age of climate hysteria is upon us. We discussed earlier this week the BBC weather forecast, scandalous hot lava red tones representing the rather temperate high of 75 degrees. But since then, we've had more. The climate lobby is quite literally ramping up the heat. Yesterday, The Guardian claimed that the Gulf Stream could collapse as early as 2025, but it was soon debunked by world-leading climate scientist Jonathan Foley, who explained the publication had confused the entire Gulf Stream with the much smaller current, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. He said, quote, "It's like comparing a superhighway with a side street. There is zero chance the Gulf Stream will collapse," unquote. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is considered the most rigorous authority on climate change, and its annual reports publish all sorts of scenarios over the next 100 years or so based on forecasts. The point is, these are forecasts, and there are a range of them. The climate fanatics, like Just Stop Oil, focus on the worst-case scenarios and then treat them as if they were fact. The fearmongers also fail to mention that a global study showed about 500,000 people die annually from heat, but 4.5 million people die from cold. This means as temperatures have increased over 20 years, this has caused an extra 116,000 heat deaths each year. But the fanatics don't mention that this now sees 283,000 fewer cold deaths every year. As Bjorn Lomborg points out, so far climate change saves 166,000 lives every year. And these claims all act as a pretense under which costly net zero policies are being implemented. Climate change is undoubtedly a real issue, but the solutions do not lie in making us colder or poorer or in fear-mongering. In fact, it could be the fear-mongering that creates a greater danger in itself, that of a declining population. The Times revealed earlier this week that only half of Generation Z and millennials plan to start families. This is a real crisis, and not one that is invented, but people aren't fretting about it as much as climate change. The UK birth rate sits at 1.56 per woman. This is significantly below the replacement rate of 2.1, which would keep the population at a stable level. But with fewer children, the population shrinks and the population ages. Now, in this country, immigration has been a short-term palliative, but in countries such as Japan, they haven't had that, and they're already beginning to see the problem, as we do because of life expectancy, which has meant that the number of retired people is supported by a smaller number of taxpayers. The low birth rate exacerbates that problem and would mean that you have a smaller tax base to support those who are retired and need the help, the benefits, the healthcare. Now, Japan has led the way in this. Its birth rate is even lower than ours, and it hasn't had immigration, so it's already suffering these consequences. And interestingly, the Times findings showed that one of the main reasons why young people are reluctant to have children is because of climate change. Hence my concern about the fear-mongering that has been created over this issue. And the idea that having children means damaging the environment is anyway, in and of itself, mistaken. Interestingly, older and younger people have different economic attributes. It's been reported by The Economist, not a particularly conservative newspaper or magazine. It fleshed this out. Old people, interestingly, have crystallized intelligence, and that is a stock of knowledge built up over a long period of time, expertise, if you will, wisdom. Meanwhile, young people tend to have more fluid intelligence, meaning the ability to engage with new ideas and to be more innovative. So in other words, a younger population means a more innovative population. What's the number one way we can deal with climate change? The way we've made things cleaner over centuries? It's by innovation. If you have an ageing population in which fewer and fewer people have children, in Britain and indeed the world, then we'll become less innovative and less inventive, and that will create problems of its own. If we want an economy that can tackle climate change, we need more children. And I've done my bit by having 6, so now let me encourage you to do yours. The more children, the merrier. As always, I want to know your thoughts. Please email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. And I'm now joined by my panel, the co-founder of Momentum, James Schneider, and the former Brexit Party MEP, who I am related to, Annunciata Rees-Mogg. James, first of all, thank you very much for coming in. Does it concern you that by always looking at the worst-case scenario and assuming that is what will happen, actually people are being put off the climate change argument?
The problem is that the worst-case scenario is what keeps on happening, in fact, often much worse than the worst-case scenario. So you mentioned the IPCC reports. The worst-case scenario in each set of reports, we've had 6 sets of reports, is what moves towards being the trend outcome come the next report. If you look at what's happening this year, so, for example, it's 0.4 degrees hotter in the Northern Hemisphere than it has ever been. That was statistically almost impossible from the perspective of last year. If you look at the extent of Antarctic ice, if you look at the same for Greenland, if you look at the Arctic Sea, these are moving in actually extremely alarming direction and moving faster than the worst-case scenario in the IPCC report.
But the consequences haven't been what the fearmongers have predicted, because the IPCC has made it clear that the hurricanes in the US are no worse than they've historically been. We've had wildfires consistently throughout history, and therefore, yes, the temperature has been going up, and nobody's trying to deny that, but that if you ameliorate the consequences, you have a much better chance of dealing with it than if you bring the economy to a full stop.
Well, the most significant threat, I think, from a kind of sober assessment of the data, and I wish this weren't the case, I don't want this to be happening, and I also would rather that fossil fuels didn't cause this problem because they're an incredibly energy-dense source of fuel, but unfortunately they are. So that's the situation in which we have to live, in which we're confronting things.
Annunciata, I think the key statistic is this one on more lives being lost to cold than through heat, and that actually a slightly warmer climate, slightly warmer globe, is helping people to live. That must be a good thing.
And this has been known for decades. And you can ameliorate an awful lot of the problems that a warming climate creates in terms of both flooding and drought, but you also save far more lives by the average temperature being warmer. And it's stupid to ignore it and just penalise people who are suffering from a financial crisis not of their own making, that our country is, the cost of living is going through the roof and interest rates are on the up, and so is inflation. And we've got to make sure that people can be comfortable and healthy And actually focusing on penalising people is not the way forward.
Which is what public policy seems to be doing at the moment.
It does. And in fact, these people who were asked about whether they want to have children or not, 49% of them wanted more time to themselves. Well, we've got a terrible childcare policy in this country. There is very little support for people who want to get back to work or need to get back to work, and that has to be appreciated. And 47% put it down to money. Well, again, if we're not supporting people in having families, in breeding the next generation who can innovate and help the human race, then we're failing.
James, you're a Democrat. You set up Momentum. You co-founded Momentum, which was a grassroots democratic organisation of worrying successful nature from the point of view of people like me. Surely you think that you have to have policies that people will vote for? And people won't vote to be cold and poor, being told what to do by people on high.
I absolutely believe that you should have policies that people want, which is why I support things that the overwhelming majority of people want, which are completely shut out from the political spectrum. Things like public ownership, things like a wealth tax, things like £15 an hour minimum wage. Part of the problem of our political system is that it creates such a narrow spectrum of establishment opinion and presents that as being the only political options, which is why you see all these other things are so supported but are shut out from politics.
But do you think that's right? Because cheap energy has been the force of improving standards of living across the globe as far back as you wish to go in history, and that making energy more expensive is bound to lower living standards, which people aren't in the end going to vote for.
So, Jacob, I don't disagree with you that the cost of energy has been probably the key determinant in the development of the world for the last 200 years, and that's been fossil fuels, incredibly energy-dense fossil fuels. They're fantastic fuel. We have two problems. The first is that they're finite, and so even without my second point, that without climate breakdown, we would have to start to build the infrastructure. And remember, we've spent 150 to 200 years building out not only our energy infrastructure, but our entire economic infrastructure, our infrastructure of trade, how our cities operate, all on the basis of fossil fuels. We'd have to already be moving away from them. But we have climate breakdown, and the way in which you're both speaking about as if it's this gradual rise in temperature isn't quite right. The real danger is tipping points, which is what have happened. If you look at the geological history, you see sometimes really quite rapid changes in temperature, in ice cover and so on. And what I find quite worrying, and again, I don't take any pleasure in this is from a sober assessment of the scientific papers. For example, there's a paper in the journal Science, very respected journal back end of last year, which said that tipping points start to become likely, particularly the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet and the boreal forest in Siberia melting, begins to become likely at 1.5 degrees. Now, what happens then is not just it's a little bit hotter. We then begin to see quite radical changes in the weather systems of our entire planet, and that's really why it's so threatening. So,
Annunziata, on the issue of finite resources, that's obviously true. Fossil fuels will run out eventually. Gladstone thought coal would run out in 1966.
Well, and peak oil has been talked about for my entire life, and we're still not there.
We're not there.
And we find new and innovative ways to do things, and we've created nuclear fuel, and we haven't made the most of it, unlike other countries that are hugely benefiting now, such as France. We've got to make sure that we are at the forefront of using the most effective technology available, and that's got to be partly nuclear, but also clean coal, that actually you can clean up an awful lot of the problems that fossil fuels bring.
And that's really important because that's something that has actually happened over the 200 years of economic growth, that we've moved from wood to coal to oil to gas, and every step of the way it's become cleaner. Yeah. And this is where, to go back to the point on population, we need the young population who are innovative, who will think these things up. And if we just have an old population, then society ultimately decays.
You stick with the status quo and you get nowhere. Absolutely. You need new, bright minds to come through.
And that means, well, you've done your duty. You've got quite a lot of children.
I've just discovered I'm nearly double the average. I had no idea.
You've done in the Soviet Union, if you had 10 children, you got made a heroine of the Soviet Union. There aren't many of those around.
I don't have 10.
No,
Thank
you don't
goodness.
have 10. But, James, does it worry you that young people are saying, we don't want to have children?
Yeah, I think it's extremely sad. I think that the desire to have community and family is a pretty universal thing throughout humanity and throughout history. But if you look at the poll for the top reasons that you're quoting in the piece in the Times, it's to do with cost of living. Yes, there's fear about, and in my view, entirely justifiable fear about the future of the world. But right now, as Annunciata was saying, we don't have child-friendly policies, and with the cost of living so high, the cost of housing, pay is now the level it was in 2005. We have all these technological advances, but they haven't improved the living standards of the overwhelming majority of people in Britain. And for young people, it's even worse, because for an average young person, the chances of being able to get on the property ladder, have secure housing, is much lower than it was for a generation beforehand. And I think that's really what's driving people waiting to start a family.
But throughout history, people have been worried about the cost of living and the cost of having families. So the new issue is this green worry. I'll just give Annunciata the last word, because we've got to...
And we're trying to make ourselves holier than thou by importing cheap labour, by pretending that we are being the best and everything, but we're not. We are damaging our own economy.
Well, thank you very much to my panel. Don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up, has Nigel Farage claimed another scalp? And why is Sir Keir Starmer a bit fishy?
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Christine, first we had Project Fear for Brexit, then for the pandemic, and now we have it for climate change. I wonder what will be next. Jeff, surely we solve the population crisis with immigration. Jeff, you must re-listen, rewind and listen to what Annunciata had to say, because I think she answered that. Philip, if there's even a chance of these worst-case scenarios, shouldn't we be worried? It's a moot point after COVID when we kept on talking about worst-case scenarios that didn't happen. Anyway, it was just a matter of time, I think, as far as one can tell, until the chief executive of Coutts, Peter Flavelle, stepped down from his post following the departure of Dame Alison Rose from NatWest. That's exactly what happened this afternoon. Mr. Flavelle announced his departure and said the treatment of Mr. Farage had fallen below the bank's high standards of personal service. And from personal experience, they are very high standards. As I said the other day, or usually, it's strange the banks took this long to act. If Dame Alison had come out immediately and cleared the air, taking responsibility, she might just have got away with it. Nonetheless, my colleague Nigel Farage has pointed out that there are countless other people in his position who have suffered similar treatment for all sorts of reasons, one of whom joins me now, the former Brexit Party MEP, Ben Habib. Ben, thank you for coming in.
It's a pleasure.
Because it is now the broader issue, isn't it, that NatWest has had to lose some people. NatWest, I imagine, will change its policies. It won't do this again. But the whole regulated space, the banking industry and other financial services, and indeed corporate culture as a whole, has been inculcated, indoctrinated with this woke attitude that's making it harder to do business.
It has, absolutely. And it's a terrific thing that Nigel's done to shine a very bright light on NatWest and Coutts to reveal the way that this has infected those two banks. But as you say, it's very important we don't let the problem stop there, because the problem, which I think we discussed last time I was on, comes through the form of environmental, social and corporate governance regulations. Now, these are slightly badly defined regulations, foisting obligations on directors of companies to drive towards net zero, to deliver social justice in the communities in which they operate, but not being precise on what that means. And in the case of NatWest and Coutts, and many other in fact, all regulated entities pretty much, all listed businesses pretty much, all public bodies pretty much, and all the businesses which they do business, they've adopted this social justice approach by delivering what they call inclusivity, diversity and inclusivity, which is the championing of ethnic minority rights, minority religions, people from transgender background.
That's not a bad thing.
That's not a bad thing. But what it's allowed people to do, what it's encouraged, and this is encouraged by the regulations and the regulators, is for them to take a view on those issues insofar as other people are concerned. And what I think's happened with NatWest, and it starts with Coutts, of course, is that they looked at Nigel. Nigel is someone who wants to have a debate about net zero. He's against immigration, unbridled immigration, the way that we're experiencing it. He wants to treat all ethnicities equally, not to champion black ethnicity or BAME or whatever it is over anything else. And they decided he was a bad man. And I think that's where they went wrong. Even once they were called out on it, they were so convinced, Alison Rose was so convinced that she had the moral high ground, that she could stand her position, even rubbish him in the public domain, and she'd get away with it.
But isn't it a problem with the whole corporate culture that is focused on anything other than delivering service for profit, that actually the best service provided by a business is that it is competitive and its price is lower than anybody else's, so that the consumer gets best value and has more money in his or her pocket to buy other services, and that ESG becomes a catch-all for bad service and poor management.
And higher costs.
And higher costs, and therefore makes people worse off, makes consumers worse off.
Absolutely. It's infected our economy, and it is undermining our economy. It's in every bit of our economic ecosystem. And I really hope that the battle that Nigel's having shines a light not just on these banks, but right across that problem.
How much do you think comes from government and from regulation, and how much comes from the culture of our times, which is probably harder to change?
I'm afraid to say a lot of it comes from government regulation, government laws and regulations. So the first evidence of this was in Section 172 of the Companies Act 2006, which foists this rather nebulous obligation on directors to promote the communities in which they operate. Then you have the medium and large listed companies reporting regulations 2008, which requires them to report on ESG. You have the listing rules from the stock exchange, which require listed companies to report on it, and so on and so forth. And there's a myriad of these laws and regulations, and they come together ultimately in an obligation to report on them. And by making companies and businesses report on them, businesses have to be seen to be complying with them. And as you say, the received wisdom, the established moral correctitude of the times in which we live is that diversity and inclusion is the way forward. When you and I were brought up, and I imagine this was the case for you, certainly was for me, I was told it doesn't matter what colour you are, doesn't matter where you came from, doesn't matter what your religion is, couldn't care about your sexual preferences. What we want you to be is a good, upstanding member of society. And that's where we've gone wrong.
This is really important because discrimination is wrong whether it's positive or negative. That if you are holding one group of people back to promote another, that is fundamentally unfair, and the state should not be involved in picking one citizen over another.
Absolutely. But that is precisely what these regulations have resulted in. So there's a regulatory encouragement of this. And the regulator here, one thing that we haven't really talked about is the role of the Financial Conduct Authority. Now, they would have been overseeing Coutts and NatWest in the promotion of these, what I would call divisive policies. And then, of course, the breach of private information.
Well, the Bank of England's gone quite wild on this anyway, that it's discouraged lending to the oil and gas sector. It redesigned its logo to show it was more inclusive and all that sort of nonsense, even spent money on that rather than focusing on dealing with inflation, its primary responsibility, and making banks keep information confidential, which is their primary
Which is absolutely fundamental aspect of banking. And
this is the thing that really surprises me about the board of NatWest, is that when I heard that Dame Alison, and I heard in the GBNews studio, had admitted that she was the source, I knew immediately she had to go and that it would be hours or days at most. I cannot understand why the board didn't get that.
And the reason I think, I come back to it, Jacob, I think the reason is they had decided Nigel is a bad man, and they couldn't see beyond that. They were so hijacked by their ideology.
And this costs people money because businesses that aren't focused on the bottom line charge
They're getting it wrong.
Our viewers higher prices. That's the key. Anyway, thank you very much, Ben. Coming up, are there more damning repercussions from lockdown? Plus, could you live for 10 years without meat?
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Jonathan Vautry here with your latest GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. There's been a fair amount of cloud around today, and we are holding on to that into the overnight period as well. A lot of cloudy skies, some clear spells trying to poke their way through, but the cloud definitely the dominating weather variable. The cloud will be thick enough for some outbreaks of drizzle throughout the night, some longer spells of rain for north-east Scotland as well. For Northern Ireland, south-west Scotland, a few clearer spells developing, and it's here where temperatures will drop down a little bit more, but elsewhere underneath that cloud it is going to be another humid, muggy night, no lower than 15, 16 degrees Celsius in some towns and cities. But it's this fresher air that's filtering in from the southwest that will also steadily progress its way eastwards throughout the day, and that's going to allow the cloud to break up a lot more compared to what we saw throughout today. So more in the way of those brighter and sunnier spells developing. Still a scattering of showers, generally on the lighter side, most persistent for parts of Northern Ireland. Temperatures in those sunnier spots between 20 and 24 degrees Celsius. Into the weekends, though, our attention turns to this area of low pressure that's going to be slowly pushing its way in from the northwest. So things turning more unsettled again. Those occluded fronts bringing bands of showers our way. Some of those could turn heavy with some hail and thunderstorms in the mixture, perhaps more persistently for Northern Ireland, parts of northwest Scotland on Saturday. Still some sunny spells in between those showers, but the breeze will be picking up for all of us and quite a blustery day to come, remaining unsettled throughout the rest of the weekend and into the start of the new working week as well. Enjoy your evening. Bye-bye.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard.
We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think. Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. William says, whosoever is appointed the new chief executive of Coutts Bank should, and without further equivocation, offer Nigel Farage a public, full apology and reinstate his bank accounts. Well, I completely agree with that. I think without further equivocation, hesitation or deviation, and they should do it in just a minute. Peter, how is it that the large profits made by NatWest Bank have not been used to repay the taxpayers who bailed them out? It's a very important question. As is this, millions of school children missing lessons will cause a surge in violent crime, according to an analysis by the Centre for Social Justice. The failure to get children back into school to pre-pandemic levels will see a tidal wave of youth crime. Last year, the number of persistently absent pupils rose from 800,000 to 1.7 million. That's more than doubling. These pupils have been called ghost children, who have disappeared from the system following the pandemic. This matters because the research predicts these pupils are 3 times more likely to commit serious offences with lifelong consequences for them and for society. Though the government has introduced provisions to help students catch up on lost learning during the pandemic, these resources only help children who are in the system, but the ghost children have disappeared. So joining me now to discuss this is Deputy Director of the Centre for Social Justice, Jessica Prestige. Jessica, thank you so much for coming in. This is really important. So 900,000 more children are now out of the system than before. Of the 800,000 previously, what were they doing? Why were they not in the system?
As in the...
Before the pandemic, there were 800,000. Were they mainly homeschooled? Were they mainly playing truant? What is the scale of the increase in the problem?
I mean, I would say we don't have a very detailed breakdown of the reasons for persistent absence pre-pandemic, but I think it is probably fair to say that the kind of nature of absence was more consistent pre-pandemic. And with this kind of very significant spike that we've seen, with persistent absence rising to 1.7 million, as you say, there's a huge amount of diversity within that figure. So we as the CSJ have spent a lot of time talking to parents and small charities and schools to try and get to the bottom of what's driving this increase. And what's become really obvious is that there's not any kind of one-size-fits-all prescription here because the reasons are so varied. We are very consistently hearing that mental health is a problem, with anxiety coming up in particular. I would also probably point to a slight kind of erosion in attitudes towards the necessity of school among parents. And I think that's largely a product of lockdown and school closures. Children were obviously all sent home and suddenly school became kind of less necessary.
So if you say to parents, you don't need to send your child to school for the best part of 2 years.
Exactly.
They then think when that period's up, well, why were we bothering? Why are we getting up at 7 o'clock in the morning to get our children to school when they didn't need to go before?
Exactly, and I would say that kind of the series of strikes that we've seen as well that have led to a number of school closures haven't helped with that either.
And then anxiety. Is anxiety the reality, or is it also partly an excuse parents use when they get found out that their children aren't coming into school? Instead of getting fined for not sending their children in, they say, oh, my child's got anxiety.
I mean, I think that's a very difficult question to answer. I think it is obvious that in a lot of cases parents are struggling too, so a blame game probably isn't particularly productive here, which is why we're recommending the national rollout of attendance mentors. The idea being that these are specialist key workers who work with families to get under the skin of what's driving persistent absence, and then they're able to kind of prescribe remedies on a case-by-case basis. And in some cases, that might be very, very kind of softly. In others, it might require a kind of firmer hand.
And how would the mentors work? Would they be attached to individual schools? Would they be existing teachers within schools given a further responsibility? And where would the resources come from?
So they absolutely wouldn't be teachers given additional responsibility. I think we are very sympathetic to the fact that teachers their workload is sufficient and we don't want to add to that. So the idea with attendance mentors is that they would be attached to the local authority and then they would work with particular schools within that remit. And
how does the local authority know who isn't attending? Because you don't have to tell the local authority that you're not attending, do you?
So it would really be kind of a relational response. So it would be based on the relationships that attendance mentors develop with schools in their area.
And to go back to the earlier times, was 800,000 a reasonable number not to be attending, or was that still too high? Is there a target level that is a sort of acceptable level of non-attendance?
I mean, to my mind, any level of non-attendance is too high.
Other than homeschooling, obviously, because then...
Yes, this is absolutely not about homeschooling. This is a very separate issue. We're talking about children that should be at school and they're not attending school as much as they should be, whether they're severely absent, which means they're missing 50% of their school time, or they're persistently absent, which means they're missing 10% of their school time. This is not about kids that are receiving their education via other means.
And the increase in violent crime concern, how is that estimated? Where does that come from? How big a worry is that?
So basically what we did was analyse published government data which looks at the educational characteristics of young offenders. And from that data, we were able to kind of establish the risk factor associated with persistent absence. And then what we did was apply that risk factor to 2 potential future scenarios. In scenario 1, persistent absence rates return to their pre-pandemic level. And in scenario 2, persistent absence rates remain elevated at their current level. And the difference between those 2 numbers is the 9,000 potential additional young offenders that we're talking about, which sounds a little bit opaque, I appreciate, but the kind of key fact here is that persistently absent pupils are around 3 times more likely to go on to commit an offence. So it's clearly a very significant risk factor that government needs to have in mind.
And is a very high cost, because people who go on to be persistent offenders then meet the criminal justice system, then end up in prison, and therefore the mentors could be actually aware in the long term, not only, most importantly, of giving children a second chance, but also would pay for themselves because of the savings you would get through avoiding these criminal justice costs.
Yes, exactly. So we've kind of estimated that the cost of this increase in youth offending would be around 100 million. And the cost of a national rollout of attendance mentors would be about 80 million. And we're proposing that that is paid for from the National Tutoring Programme underspend. Because, as you say, the National Tutoring Programme is a great initiative. Providing resources to help kids catch up is really important, but they can't catch up if they're not in school in the first place. So we think getting children back into the classroom is kind of absolutely fundamental to helping them catch up.
So you've come up with a scheme that actually is self-funding in the long term, but also in the shorter term, because there's the underspend on the tutoring programme, and therefore the resources are available for this within the system, that you'd be moving it from the schools to the local authorities. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, we're talking about underspend, so this isn't money that schools are using, this is money that's being returned to the Treasury. We're not talking about withdrawing resource from schools. But yes, the attendance mentors would sit with the local authority.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica, for coming in. Coming up, the Duke of Sussex is in the news again, but I thought he wanted privacy.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my new show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m, where real people get to meet those in power and hold them to account. Every week, we'll be hearing your views from up and down the country in the real world. Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. every Sunday from 11. Join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
In a recent interview, Sir Keir Starmer said that his children didn't eat meat until they were 10 years old, when he and his wife first gave them the choice. Starmer, who is a pescatarian, I always thought he was a bit fishy, and his wife, who is a strict vegetarian, brought their children up with no meat or fish in the house. Surprised by this, I set up a focus group of 6 children from Somerset to ask how they would feel had they been brought up in a vegetarian household. We can reveal exclusively tonight on State of the Nation the results. Peter, aged 15, said he would probably have felt hungry, malnourished and ill, been much shorter and probably, heaven forfend, woke. Mary, 14, wisely commented that she wouldn't have been able to cope without a good fillet steak in my life. Yes, I like Tornado's Rossini. Thomas, 13, said we wouldn't be very good at sport as we wouldn't be fit enough. Anselm, I think aged 11, spoke for the nation, most children, when he said, I would not have been a happy child because I like chicken. Alfred gave a great response. Alfred, aged 7, merely said, angry. And finally, Sixtus, who is 6, informed us that he would not have liked it. So the Rees-Moggs have spoken, and they seem to be unified in their agreement. They would not have wanted to be vegetarian whilst growing up, or not growing up if they were so malnourished that they didn't actually grow, and clearly feel that eating meat has been beneficial, particularly to their sporting ventures, as Thomas so rightly pointed out. Now, with me is Senior Media Communications Manager at PETA, Jennifer White, as well as my panel, Communications Director of Progressive International, James Schneider, and the former Brexit Party MEP, Annunciata Rees-Mogg. Well, thank you very much for coming in. Jennifer, I'll go to you first. You're probably in favour of not eating meat.
Absolutely. Vegetarian is a great first step. Vegan would be the best step, of course, for children to be raised on a vegan diet. And, you know, a lot of this comes down to if children were better educated about the horrors of where meat comes from, of how animals are slaughtered at the abattoir and how they're farmed, then they would be horrified at how they're treated, because children have a natural empathy towards animals. And that's why it really is up to parents to be honest with their children about who is on the dinner table. And we know that the meat industry and the dairy industry, they whitewash the treatment of animals to appease consumers. And that's why we don't see children being taken on a school trip to the local slaughterhouse. But yet there are meat sausages being served in the school canteen.
Well, sausages are delicious and children love them.
But you can get vegan sausages now, which are equally delicious, are better for the planet.
Not if you're from Lincolnshire.
Any of the cholesterol and saturated fat that is associated with meat. And also the World Health Organization has classed meat, processed meat and red meat, as a class 1 carcinogenic, which, to give a bit of context, is the same as asbestos and smoking.
But mankind's always eaten meat. It's part of our nature.
Well, that's why the NHS
That's why we've evolved.
We're omnivores. We're omnivores, and it's part of our nutritional balance, and a balanced diet is clearly good for you. You want a bit of all the different food types. And if you just look at milk, for example, which a vegan obviously wouldn't have dairy, then a glass of cow's milk has about 8 grams of protein, and almond milk has 1. That it's a no-brainer that for a child, particularly when they are growing and need that protein, it is beneficial to their diet. And you say that we don't take children to visit abattoirs, and I have to admit not. but I certainly have children who have seen animals being dismembered for food. And what you learn is that you treat it with respect. They have been round dairy farms, very active dairy farms.
Let me get James
Because
in.
when you're in the countryside, that's what you do.
Let
if
me
you
get
live in a
James
town, it might be
because
different.
it may be the one thing you admire Keir Starmer for, or is that pushing it too far?
Perhaps. I mean, I don't particularly want to get into how people bring up their children and feed their children and so on and so forth. But I think giving children a choice seems a pretty grown-up way to deal with them because it's a grown-up way to deal with your own children.
But how old would you start giving your children choice?
I would have to look into it a bit more, but something around that sort of age, I suppose, 11, 13. I'm not sure, something along those lines.
And that healthy eating has, for centuries, involved meat being part of the diet, that it is how we've evolved. I mean, just look at our teeth. We are designed to eat meat. Isn't it unnatural
if we
not
just
to eat meat?
go back to the milk points that you brought up, milk is associated with a host of different cancers. It's filled with saturated fat and
saturated fat, there's different evidence on saturated fat. It's not being so bad for you after all.
They've got that wrong.
Cow's milk is for baby cows. It's to turn a calf into a 600-kilogram cow, whereas plant milk, like oat milk, soy milk, almond milk, that has been designed with humans in mind.
No, it hasn't. It's for plants.
It has been fortified with all of the nutrition.
In which case, it is an overproduced product that has all the problems associated with that type of food. And what you want is the most natural food possible, which has been shown time and again to be better for you. And the saturated fat in dairy products is beneficial because it has more good cholesterol that helps the heart.
Funny that children are always told to eat their fruits and vegetables, but then as
because they don't like it, because they
saying it, then parents.
No, they're told to eat it because they don't like it, and they enjoy eating their sausages and their bacon. And Nunziata, I can embarrass her now. She used to love that most plasticky, soggy ham she ate by the half-hundredweight when she was a child. That's what children like. They gobble it up, whereas the vegetables they don't want.
But that is not in a child's best interest either. And if we look at the future of the planet, well, I mean, there's not going to be much of the future if we keep consuming as much meat and dairy as
if we didn't farm, there wouldn't be the cows.
But, you know, we have nothing against farmers.
We'd better finish. I'm sorry we didn't have time to talk about the Duke of Sussex privacy. He's probably quite pleased about that. But thank you very much to my panel. That's all from me. Up next, it's Professor Daniel Wootton. Daniel, what have you got on your programme this evening?
OK, Jacob, look, if you didn't have time, I guess I'm going to have to take the baton. You know, I'll be very reluctant to do so. But don't worry, I've got Lady Colin Campbell with some exclusive insight, actually, on what this court case means. Plus, Lord Frost, live in the studio tonight, he's caused quite a stir with his views on the fact that, actually, the rising temperature in the country will be a good thing for Brits. So it's caused a huge outrage from the left, but Lord Frost will explain why he thinks it's...
Well, that's excellent. I'm glad we've left the royal story to the expert for the News viewers. That's all coming up after the weather. I'll be back on Monday at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and I'm sure it's going to be sunny in Somerset, and they held out at the Oval today as well.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Jonathan Vautry here with your latest GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. There's been a fair amount of cloud around today, and we are holding on to that into the overnight period as well. A lot of cloudy skies, some clear spells trying to poke their way through, but the cloud definitely the dominating weather variable. The cloud will be thick enough for some outbreaks of drizzle throughout the night, some longer spells of rain for North East Scotland as well. For Northern Ireland, South West Scotland, a few clearer spells developing, and it's here where temperatures will drop down a little bit more, but elsewhere underneath that cloud it is going to be another humid, muggy night, no lower than 15, 16 degrees Celsius in some towns and cities. But it's this fresher air that's filtering in from the southwest that will also steadily progress its way eastwards throughout the day, and that's going to allow the cloud to break up a lot more compared to what we saw throughout today. So more in the way of those brighter and sunnier spells developing. Still a scattering of showers generally on the lighter side, most persistent for parts of Northern Ireland. Temperatures in those sunnier spots between 20 and 24 degrees Celsius. Into the weekends, though, our attention turns to this area of low pressure that's going to be slowly pushing its way in from the northwest. So things turning more unsettled again. Those occluded fronts bringing bands of showers our way. Some of those could turn heavy with some hail and thunderstorms in the mixture, perhaps more persistently for Northern Ireland, parts of northwest Scotland on Saturday. Still some sunny spells in between those showers, but the breeze will be picking up for all of us and quite a blustery day to come, remaining unsettled throughout the rest of the weekend and into the start of the new working week as well. Enjoy your evening. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside, from boxed boilers,